proves definitively one way or the other.
Those rifles you haven't here, or they just hopefully?
We don't, and that raises a very interesting point about the museum's collections. Anything that was considered crime scene evidence, and that would be the shells, the actual Mannlicher Carcano rifle, the original cardboard schoolbook boxes, all of that considered crime scene evidence was all seized by the federal government, and that's all in the National Archives today. What we have gathered, we have 35,000 artifacts in our collection. A very few are displayed, but we have in the archives 35,000 plus artifacts. We have gone to private collectors, and we collect original documents, letters, newspapers, magazines, photographs, films, things like that. But we don't have any actual crime scene evidence in the collections, and of course that includes the rifle.
Mm-hmm. So, well, I don't know if you can answer this.
I'll do my best.
Do you think President Lyndon B. Johnson was somehow involved with this?
Well, that comes up, obviously. The fact that the president was shot here in Texas, and Lyndon Johnson was a Texan. He was known to be a very ambitious politician. And 3, he was not a real big fan and close friend of the Kennedys. He resented the Kennedys and really had a bad relationship with the president's brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy. So certainly it's interesting for many to speculate on the possibility that Lyndon Johnson was somehow involved, because he had the most to gain from the murder of the president because he became president. There's no evidence. There's just no hard evidence that beyond this speculation that connects Lyndon Johnson in any way to the Kennedy assassination. Lyndon Johnson comes up quite often in these theories. Among the usual suspects, the most popular conspiratorial suspects in this story. Besides Lyndon Johnson, you have the FBI and the CIA, government entities who were unhappy with Kennedy. Organized crime, the mafia, often plays into theories because of the Kennedy brothers and their war on organized crime, and some issues with the president's election in 1960. And then you have the communists. You have Russia and Cuba, because we were at the height of the Cold War, and Kennedy had some confrontations with Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, and obviously, with the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had direct conflicts with Fidel Castro in Cuba. And during all this time, as has since been declassified, the CIA was actually actively trying to assassinate Fidel Castro. There were government-sponsored assassination plots to remove the Cuban leader from power. And so certainly that would give Fidel Castro motivation for wanting to retaliate and murder the president. But again, beyond speculation, beyond compiling sort of an enemies list, it's really tough when you have to get down to the nitty-gritty of finding the smoking gun, finding the key pieces of evidence that really do prove a conspiracy. What we're left with is speculation and some really interesting and colorful theories, but there's just not much there to, once you scrutinize the theory, there's not much there to support it. So Lyndon Johnson falls into that category with all the other potential conspirators in the story.
Do you think the assassination of John F. Kennedy and his brother, do you think have like something similar?
That point has been raised over the years, that the powers that be, these mysterious dark forces, the folks that, allegedly masterminded the Kennedy assassination here, then looking forward 5 years, didn't want, were just terrified of Bobby Kennedy coming into the White House. I don't know. I have not investigated or really researched the Bobby Kennedy assassination at the Ambassador Hotel. A number of conspiracy theories exist about the alleged assassin Sirhan Sirhan, who is still alive, still in prison in California, who claims that he was hypnotized. He was under hypnosis at the time, and there are questions about the number of shots he fired and the number of bullet holes in the walls of the kitchen there at the Ambassador. Unfortunately, the Ambassador doesn't exist anymore. The building was torn down, and so but any physical evidence had long since been removed. But I don't know. Other than the fact that there are conspiracy theories surrounding both deaths, I can't articulate any specific connections between the two the two brothers being killed. It's just terribly unfortunate, but the Kennedy family is a family that has endured great personal tragedy over the years. The president's older brother, Joe, the one that his father, Joe Sr., had declared would be the one to run for president, he died in World War II. So the younger brother, John, had to pick up the mantle, and he's the one that became president. Bobby was assassinated. Their brother Ted, his political career was deeply affected by the Chappaquiddick scandal, where his car ran off the road and a woman died. He remained a senator till the very end of his life, and yet he was never able to effectively run for president because his reputation was very much affected outside of Massachusetts by the Chappaquiddick scandal. And then, of course, the president's young son, John Jr., who famously saluted his father's coffin on his third birthday, the day of the president's funeral. Then he died in a very tragic plane crash in 1999. Jackie Kennedy died at a very young age of cancer in 1995, I believe. The only one left from that so-called Camelot era is really the president's daughter, Caroline. That family, the Kennedys, have endured a great deal of tragedy over the years, and certainly the most distinctive being the deaths of John and Bobby Kennedy in the 60s.
You think his family is more well known for that than any other family?
More well known for tragedy?
Yeah.
Oh, I think so. The Kennedys have such an aura about them. I mean, in a lot of ways, they're the closest we've ever come to American royalty. They're very famous. Long before reality television made people famous for being famous, the Kennedy family really had a mystique about them. I shudder to compare the Kennedys to the Kardashians, but in a way the mindset was the same. If you can imagine for a moment, before reality TV and internet and cell phones and all of that social media technology that makes people popular for not really accomplishing anything in their life, if you were able to step back in time and look at the Kennedys, the way people followed their activities, the way people looked at, pictures of them on vacation and were enthralled by the wedding of John and Jackie Kennedy in the 50s and, cheered for this young senator as he ran for president. There was a mystique about the family, and every member of that family was interesting to people. And you would follow, really long before tabloid press, you would follow the activities of the Kennedys in a way somewhat similar to the way people follow everything Kim and Khloe Kardashian do today. Again, I hate to compare the Kennedys to the Kardashians, but in terms of popular culture appeal, I think an argument can be made that the Kennedys were very much a reality family, a pop culture family, long before those terms had even been coined.
So do you think that the Kennedy family was more liked than any other?
Well, there's a lot of people out there that really despised the president's father, Joe Sr. He has quite a dark history with evidence that he was a bootlegger during Prohibition, and that he may have helped to get his son, John, elected president in 1960 with the help of organized crime in Chicago. And there are certainly some stories there that make people hesitate to really embrace Joseph Kennedy Sr. as Father of the Year, but certainly there is a deep admiration for that family, particularly John F. Kennedy. Here's an example. So much has been written since 1963 to try to knock Kennedy off the pedestal that's been created for him. Stories of his deteriorating health, his Addison's disease, his womanizing, having affairs with lots of people, Marilyn Monroe, all those stories that are out there. A new book written just this year by a White House intern who claims that she had an affair with the president. All of these things have really done very little to tarnish the Kennedy image. If you really examine Kennedy's place in pop culture, he is still considered this very admirable, heroic figure. If anything, the tales of his health and womanizing and stuff just make him more interesting and more human. I don't think there's any danger of the Kennedys escaping the popular imagination anytime soon. They are, as I said, the closest I think America has come to really a royal family in terms of popular appeal and just interest. You don't have to like people, you don't have to like the Kardashians to be fascinated by who they are. So again, here I go comparing the Kennedys to the Kardashians. It's the best I can do, though, to try to make sense of it in terms of where we are here in 2012.
Do you think during the time, do you think there were any groups that really abhorred the Kennedys?
Well, it's interesting. We have a lot of artifacts in our collection from before the assassination. Kennedy appeared in Superman comics, and he was on mugs and plates and blankets and anything, and I talked to people who were kids in the 60s, and many of them tell me they had a picture of Kennedy hanging in their home, either in the family living room or in their bedroom. Kennedy was a rock star. I mean, we don't think of politicians in that respect, but Kennedy, among young people especially, certainly had an appeal that, the way of, well, who can I compare him to? Not Justin Bieber, but somebody who is very well liked. He was young, he was charismatic, he was attractive to many people. He had that great reddish brown hair, and people just really admired him, and they were happy to hang pictures of him up. That said, the other side of the coin, we have some really negative Kennedy propaganda and things in the collection. We have some really cynical things like playing cards and board games that just make fun of the family. They make fun of the Kennedys' wealth. They make fun of their influence and political power. There was a comedy album so popular it won a Grammy Award for Album of the Year and sold more copies than any other spoken word album in American history. And this was a parody of the Kennedy White House. It was called The First Family. And it was basically, think of sort of The Daily Show for 1963. It had actors, or Saturday Night Live. It had actors impersonating John F. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, the whole Kennedy family. And it was a record album, essentially just sort of gently making fun of them. And it was incredibly popular because, since it was so gentle, people who liked the Kennedys could enjoy it for what it was, and people who disliked the Kennedys found it very funny because it was, in essence, making fun of the Kennedys. So there were supporters and detractors, but you can't argue with that massive appeal and attention that the Kennedys drew from people all over the world. Whenever the Kennedys would travel, thousands and thousands of people would turn out to greet them. In France, and when Kennedy visited Berlin and when he toured Ireland, it's amazing to see an American president get treated that way. Here in the aftermath of 9/11, we're used to America not being looked upon that favorably by other nations in the world. But for John F. Kennedy, he and Jackie were both very popular figures. They represented America for millions of people around the world, and that's an important legacy that we see demonstrated every day when older folks from Ireland and England and France, they come to the museum and they can remember seeing Kennedy on television and Viva Kennedy and Viva Jackie. They remember all that, and so it plays into this appeal that exists 50 years after he died.
After when Kennedy died, did they still support the Kennedy and Jackie?
Oh yeah, because any flaws that Kennedy had while he was president immediately evaporated, because here was this wonderful, attractive, charismatic guy cut down at age 46. Kennedy will never have gray hair, he'll never have wrinkles, he'll never grow old in the popular imagination. He was frozen in time as this martyred leader. And absolutely, Kennedy's appeal rose quite a bit. I have done oral histories over the years with several individuals who say, I was a Republican, I didn't support Kennedy, but after his death, looking at the state of the nation and the political atmosphere in Dallas, the climate in which Kennedy was killed, they became Democrats. They found something to believe in after Kennedy's death. And so I would say that he was popular, but he rose to the status of icon after his death, and that's been difficult to shake ever since then. John F. Kennedy today is more myth than he is man. It's hard for people. It's like Walt Disney. You imagine Walt Disney as this figure who created all of these famous characters, but Walt Disney was a man. He was an individual with his own flaws and personality. People rarely see that. Once someone drifts into the realm of icon, There's a John Ford Western that ends with the line, "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." In other words, when the legend becomes far more significant than the actual facts, that this was just a guy who had problems and bad health and made mistakes while he was in the White House, when the legend becomes more important than these facts, you embrace the legend. That's not what the museum does. The museum really tells the story of the Kennedy years and puts it within the context of American history. But within the popular imagination, certainly Kennedy is a legend and an icon that has not faded with the passage of time. Young people continue to consider him one of the greatest presidents in American history, even though he really didn't accomplish that much when he was in the White House, and he was in the White House for less than one full term as president. It's interesting that young people who weren't alive in the 60s, rank him up there with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. It's interesting to see that, and it makes me wonder how today's politicians, 50 and 100 years from now, how they'll fare among historians and just pop culture in general.
You think the fans of Kennedy, do they compare him to the presidents that are not coming, or?
Well, whenever you have a young, charismatic guy get up and move people with his words, it draws comparisons to Kennedy. In recent memory, you had Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Both of these guys, during their campaigns, when they spoke very eloquently about America, about hope and promise, it's interesting that both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama really used the word hope to great advantage during their runs for president, their successful runs for president. This idea of hope and optimism and promise for the American people, that goes back to John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. The torch being passed to a new generation of Americans. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. A great sense of patriotic pride. So certainly you have these comparisons made to this day, Clinton and Obama. It's funny because you have the flaws also compared to Kennedy. Clinton's problems, his scandal in the second part of his administration with the White House intern, that goes back to, that draws comparisons to Kennedy and his womanizing in the White House. So certainly, there's a plus and a minus side to being compared to John F. Kennedy, but I definitely think that we are still, as a nation, looking for a leader with that kind of charisma. And when someone is Kennedy-esque, that means they can move people with their words, because he could certainly do that.
So this day, is Kennedy your favorite president, or favorite story?
I don't know. It's hard for me to say I have a favorite president. Kennedy, yeah, he's someone I admire, and certainly beyond the who shot what, that kind of stuff. I'm much more interested in the impact that the death of the president had on the nation and the world. And so I can admire Kennedy in terms of his legacy. When I talk to people who served in the Peace Corps, or decided to become astronauts, or decided to, enlist or fight for civil rights or protest the Vietnam War, and you see these people swept up in this passionate social activism, and they credit Kennedy. It's hard not to admire a man who was able to inspire so many people around the world. So in that respect, I admire him, even though I try not to bring politics into what I do here at the museum as a historian.
Since you're so into the assassination and this, have you ever had times where you dream sometimes about the whole thing?
Absolutely. It's funny you ask that, but yeah, there have been moments when I've sort of dreamed that I was in Dealey Plaza, or dreamed I was in the 1960s. You can't live this subject 5 days out of your week, from 9 to 5, immersing yourself in the music and the movies and the TV shows and the history of the 1960s, and not let your subconscious take over. So certainly, yeah. I've had dreams of being in Dealey Plaza when the assassination takes place, and when I talk to people one-on-one, it's hard not to imagine that I'm there with them in that very significant moment. So, yeah, it affects all of us, I guess, and me in particular.
Have your thoughts ever gave you some other view about this thing?
No, I don't think I've not uncovered any information, anything in my dreams. It's certainly immersing myself in the subject gives me a better perspective where I can meet people on their level. When someone, what's a good example? The Beatles, the rock group, the Beatles. They really came into prominence starting when they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in like February of 1964. So we're talking just a couple months after the assassination. When people mention the Beatles and they talk about that after the assassination in these oral histories, because I immerse myself in the time period, I can sort of understand what they're talking about because I know the facts. I know that for a lot of young people devastated by the Kennedy assassination, having this, group from England come over and just, Beatlemania, all of these screaming fans, then in a lot of ways that was a cathartic moment. That was a healing moment for young people in America devastated by the death of the president in late 1963, looking for something to embrace and believe in. And here come the Beatles. And so you have in early 1964 this intense fascination with this group from England. I'm not saying the Beatles were successful because of the Kennedy assassination, but I'm saying that as a historian, I can listen to people talk about the Beatles and make these connections in my mind because I know the time period and I know that there was this deep emotional response and this longing for something to fill the void that the assassination left. So I do feel like immersing myself in the time period helps me connect with people more and understand where they're coming from in terms of their feelings.
If you were living during the time, like right there, actually in the parade and saw everything happening, would it get you more to thinking like, about the evidence and all of this?
I suppose it's hard to actually imagine myself in Dealey Plaza. Dreaming about it's one thing, but to really truly to imagine myself in Dealey Plaza, I don't spend too much time thinking about that. Like I said, I feel like if anything, I get tired of talking about the evidence because that's what so many people want to talk about. I don't encounter very many people who really want to discuss at length the legacy of the assassination, the impact it had on social activism, and the way it inspired people. I don't get a lot of people who are interested in that because the conspiracy stuff, the bullets, the guns, the trajectories, the medical evidence, that's far more interesting. It's more fascinating for people. So that gets a little weary after a while, and so I remove myself from Dealey Plaza and try to look at the bigger picture.
Just a little fun question.
Okay.
John F. Kennedy was still living, and he was right there. What would you say to him?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Boy. I don't know. I want to give you a good answer. I'm not sure. I've never been asked that. If I had the chance to interview John F. Kennedy, what would I ask him? Assuming the assassination didn't take place or anything like that. I guess I would be interested to know what his thoughts were about how, honestly, the news media has changed. Because going back to what we were talking about earlier about Kennedy's image and things, the media was very much aware of Kennedy's health problems and his indiscretions and things like that, but it was never really reported. Not by any credible news organization. And yet now, here in 2012, we are all about gossip and dirt. That's all we're about. Entire web empires like TMZ, they are just all about dirt and gossip. And I would be really curious to know how John F. Kennedy would see the world today in terms of politicians being completely unable to have private lives because everything they've ever done is going to be scrutinized and documented online. And I think I'd like to know how Kennedy would embrace social media and the internet and things like that, and just how, as such a charismatic person who really was very skilled as a politician at moving people, I'd like to see what he could do with the world at his fingertips in terms of the internet and social media. Kennedy made great use of television. He's considered really our first television president in terms of putting his press conferences, doing televised press conferences. He participated in the very first televised presidential debate during the 1960 election. Television was a new medium. He totally embraced it and conquered it. I'd love to see what John F. Kennedy could do with Twitter or Facebook. I mean, seriously, it'd be fascinating to see how a politician could adapt to the evolution of society in terms of you've got your gossip, you've got your, that kind of stuff, not being able to have a private life, but yet you have amazing tools at your disposal to reach people all over the world. So yeah, I mean, that probably isn't the answer you're thinking of, but really, if pressed, I think I'd want to know how Kennedy would embrace the technology and culture we live in here in 2012.
What is that put into? As 30 minutes past?
We have been talking for an hour and 9 minutes, yes. And in fact, the battery's about to run out. Do you have any other questions?
Not really.
Okay.
About an hour.
Yeah, well, it happens. That's great. Okay. Well, I'm glad I was able to answer your questions. My pleasure. Thank you. You asked very good questions, some that I had never heard before. So that's wonderful. That's what it's all about. All right, let me get this turned off.